Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ezra Askedom, and I'm Associate Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Today's speaker is Dr. Theo Milonopoulos, and his lecture is entitled When Private Satellites Go to War, Commercial Satellite Technology, the War in Ukraine, and the Implications for National Security Policy. He is currently a postdoc fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House. He has held several research positions with Rand Corporation, Stanford's Hoover Institute, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, just to name a few. After he concludes his lecture, we'll open the floor to questions. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Milonopoulos to get us started. Thank you. And you are on mute.
Thank you, Isabel. Sorry for that portion of this. Let me share my screen to make sure that I've got this properly. I think we had this configured and then it disappeared. So can you all see my slides? Great.
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to speak here at Lawrence Livermore Center for Global Security Research. I'm grateful to Esmer Esgudom for hosting, to Brad Roberts and to Brandon Kirk-Williams for extending the invitation to speak with you today. And I'm also grateful to Katie Thomas for facilitating my participation. I should also note that I'll be starting a faculty position next week at Naval War College. And although I don't begin my appointment until Monday, I just want to make clear that the views expressed here are my own and don't represent any of my current or future employers. So my talk today is going to draw from a larger research project with Dr. Eric Lynn Greenberg at MIT, examining how emerging technologies that democratize intelligence disclosures shape international security. We argue that the growing availability of commercial satellite images and other open source technologies have eroded the near monopolies that governments have traditionally enjoyed over the collection and dissemination of sensitive national security information. These platforms have empowered private actors to expose government activities that were once largely hidden from public view, from the details of ongoing military operations to the development of nuclear arsenals. And these have important implications for states as they craft their foreign and national security policies. How are governments adapting to emerging technologies that leave states with fewer national security secrets? So to begin to answer this question, let's turn back the clock and go to an episode that this audience in particular is no doubt very familiar with, the Cuban Missile Crisis. As we all know, on October 14th, 1962, a U.S. spy plane captured hundreds of photographs of newly built Soviet missile installations on the island of Cuba. The discovery prompted intense internal deliberations over the course of several days within the Kennedy administration on how best to respond to the crisis. And the president delayed disclosing the presence of these missiles for over a week. He waited until he was prepared to publicly announce a naval quarantine of the island to coerce the Soviets into withdrawing the missiles. What's important to emphasize here is that the U.S. government retained a near monopoly on the intelligence regarding Soviet missiles for more than a week, allowing them to determine whether, when, and how to disclose the activities of their Soviet adversaries. It was the U.S. spy plane that first captured these reconnaissance images, which then allowed American Ambassador Adlai Stevenson to famously confront his Soviet counterpart in the United Nations with this evidence and to refute Soviet denials that the missiles had ever been placed in Cuba. And the 13-day timeline of the crisis gave leaders on all sides enough breathing room to negotiate a face-saving negotiated exit to resolve the crisis peacefully. So 4 points are worth reemphasizing here. First, the U.S. government retained near total control of the gathering and dissemination of information throughout the crisis. This meant that the government decision makers retained control over decisions about when and whether and how to disclose this intelligence publicly. And this control over the disclosure decision gave the Kennedy administration time to deliberate privately over options before the public and the Soviets themselves became aware of what the U.S. government knew about the missiles in Cuba. Finally, these factors ultimately gave both Washington and Moscow more freedom of action to explore various options for resolving the crisis peacefully than would have otherwise been available had the crisis become public at the moment of detection. So now let's imagine an alternate reality, one that more closely resembles our own information technology environment. Imagine that the same hundreds of small, inexpensive, commercially operated satellites that orbit the Earth today were available in 1962 to beam down high-resolution images to private companies. Now imagine instead of waiting for more than a week for the US government to reveal these images, customers of the private satellite companies, such as think tanks and media organizations, legally obtain these images and publish them within days of their discovery. This erosion of government control over the information available to a wider range of actors would have dramatically compressed the time that the Kennedy administration would have had to deliberate privately before the public and the Soviets themselves got wind of what the Americans knew. And it would have severely limited the freedom of action the president's advisors had to explore private negotiations with the Soviets that helped resolve the crisis. Now it's quite possible that the very existence of satellite imagery on the commercial market would have discouraged the Soviets from even attempting to install these missiles in Cuba from the get-go, knowing that they might get detected by private companies. But what is clear is that a multitude of actors, from think tanks and media organizations to amateur sleuths, have greater access to information from commercial satellite imagery and other open source platforms in ways that can accelerate the pace of international crises today. And all these elements have the potential to expand or constrain a government's freedom of action as they adapt to a world with fewer secrets. For instance, it was analysts at Middlebury Institute's James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies and the American Federation of Sciences that used commercial satellite imagery from the private firm Planet to reveal the construction of hundreds of missile silos in the deserts of Western China. It was near real-time imagery from commercial satellites operated by Maxar Technologies that documented the chaos unfolding at Kabul's international airport during the final days of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan last August. Now, a combination of technological advances, decreased launch costs, and regulatory changes have accelerated the expansion of the commercial satellite sector, whose market size is expected to grow to $4.17 billion by 2027, with companies expecting to have over 700 satellites in orbit. Planet alone claims to operate more than 200 imaging satellites that capture the whole Earth's land mass daily. Coupled with the lower costs, these rapidly proliferating satellites and the widening availability of these images among the broader public has eroded the near monopoly that governments have traditionally maintained over sensitive security information. These technologies enable more rapid collection and dissemination of overflight images of higher resolution in near real time. And the US government does exercise some shutter control by restricting companies from releasing images of certain geographical areas and limits on the resolutions of these images that the companies can sell on the open market. Private satellite firms have nevertheless found a more permissive regulatory environment than they since the 1990s. And because private companies own and operate these platforms, these technologies erode governmental control over what we call, my co-author and I, the disclosure decision, which is the choice by governments to determine when, how, and under what conditions to release sensitive security information about their activities and those of their adversaries. As governments surrender control over the disclosure decision to private companies, they have worked to leverage the release of sensitive information to their strategic advantage. For instance, states can use images disclosed by non-government entities to expose norm-violating behavior perpetrated by their adversaries. BuzzFeed News won a Pulitzer Prize last summer for using satellite imagery to expose the scope and scale of China's mass detention of Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minorities in its western provinces. In other cases, governments that know that they are being surveilled can use this knowledge to their advantage. Nuclear weapons expert James Acton suggested it was possible that China wanted the construction of its missile silos to be detected as part of an elaborate shell game to obscure the true size of its arsenal and complicate efforts to target Chinese missile sites. Given how little effort Beijing went to hide these activities from overflight platforms, it's quite possible that it was trying to add more noise to the information gathering efforts and thereby obscure the relevant signals about its true nuclear ambitions. Governments can also benefit by having non-state entities disclose information that they want publicly released. Some officials may want to make public information that they've collected about adversaries, but they may be dissuaded from releasing this information to avoid jeopardizing sources and methods that they use to gather this information. Public disclosures by non-government entities, like private satellite companies, can help agencies talk openly about threatening behavior they've observed in non-public arenas. For instance, U.S. Strategic Command seized on the public disclosure of China's missile silo construction through commercial satellite imagery to reinforce its warnings of China's growing missile threat. Indeed, Admiral Charles Richard, commander of U.S. STRATCOM, even encouraged independent analysts to continue the hunt for Chinese missile silos, saying at an industry conference, quote, "If you enjoy looking at commercial satellite imagery or other stuff in China, can I suggest you keep looking?" The relative independence of private satellite firms and the analysts who interpret their images can enhance the credibility of the claims that government officials make, thereby bolstering public support for their proposed policies. As Air Force Chief of Staff General C.Q. Brown put it, it's kind of a good thing that it's out there. It actually helps validate what we've been talking about, why we need this capability. But just as private satellite images can bolster the credibility of the claims government officials make, so too can they undermine their claims when these images expose contradictions between the statements that leaders make and realities on the ground. For instance, after returning from his May 2018 summit, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, President Donald Trump tweeted that everybody can now feel much safer because there is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. Within months, however, news reports circulated commercial satellite imagery identifying 13 hidden missile bases north of the 38th parallel, challenging the president's claims. It is possible that the president's tweet was designed to bolster Kim's own commitment to the deal that he'd struck in May 2018. But even if the missile activity did not explicitly violate the terms of the summit agreement, the imagery cast doubt on the president's later insistence that the rockets and missiles had, quote, stopped. The exposure of this difference between leaders' statements and realities on the ground could foreclose future diplomatic overtures the same leader may attempt to make and increase pressure for more escalatory actions among domestic audiences. Moreover, just as commercial satellites can collect open source intelligence on American adversaries, they have the potential to provide information about U.S. military operations to those same adversaries in ways that could jeopardize our own military operations and installations. In one instance, the New York Times used commercial satellite images to document the growth of U.S. installations on the African continent. And although the United States can regulate the activities of U.S.-based companies, its reach may be more limited in preventing foreign companies from revealing sensitive security information. So the benefits and drawbacks of commercial satellite imagery have been even more pronounced in the war in Ukraine, the first major conflict to unfold under the gaze of private satellites. How has this technology shaped the conduct of modern conflict? Well, the widespread availability of commercial satellite imagery documented the mobilization of Russian forces, and it helped confirm U.S. claims in the lead-up to the invasion that an invasion of Ukraine by Russia was imminent, which then helped galvanize the American public and even skeptical European allies in European capitals to the Ukrainian cause. It also helped counter Russian disinformation campaigns in the conflict's early days, denying Moscow the element of surprise in its mobilization efforts and challenging Russian claims that its troops had been withdrawn. According to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, the intelligence we're sharing is actually confirmed also with open sources, with satellite imagery from commercial satellites. As Stacey Dixon, Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence in the United States, put it, commercial satellites, quote, allow others to independently interpret the images, piecing them together with other information and telling the world what is about to happen. Once Russian forces invaded across the Ukrainian border, commercial satellite imagery helped streamline information sharing with Ukrainian analysts. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency confirmed that it helped facilitate independent private efforts to supply commercial satellite products to Ukrainian analysts, allowing Ukrainian forces to access advanced synthetic aperture radar satellite data that would allow them to monitor developments on the ground through cloud cover, which often covers much of Ukraine. The outsourcing of this information sharing pipeline helped the United States deliver crucial intelligence to Ukraine without compromising its own sources and methods. These open source tools have been important enough that the Pentagon listed commercial satellite imagery services alongside more traditional hardware as part of the security system packages that it delivered to Ukraine by April 2022. Now, commercial satellite imagery and other open source intelligence has also been used to help verify claims about battlefield progress, publicly documenting Russia's setbacks in spite of claims to the contrary, and bolstering perceptions of Ukrainians' unexpectedly fierce resistance. They also helped expose atrocities committed by Russian forces against civilians in Bucha and refuted Moscow's denials that these horrors had in fact occurred. Now, even as the war in Ukraine grinds on, states are already preparing for a world in which commercial satellite imagery and other open sources of intelligence will play a greater role in future conflicts. News reports indicate that NATO is considering buying imagery directly from commercial satellite firms to supplement their own intelligence gathering capabilities. But growing reliance on these systems can be a double-edged sword. Although they can facilitate information sharing with partners and allies without revealing sources and methods, these images could also be used to spread disinformation rather than combat it. Rivals could attempt to manipulate commercial satellite imagery or use artificial intelligence to make deepfakes images. Even non-manipulated photos can be interpreted and even non-manipulated photos need to be interpreted and analyzed carefully to reach accurate conclusions about what they can and cannot tell us. A picture may be worth 1,000 words, but they don't speak for themselves. Moreover, the more that belligerents rely on these commercial platforms, the more that private firms could find their assets in the crosshairs of rival militaries. Russia already tried and failed to hack and jam the satellite-based Starlink service that is the sole internet service provider in parts of Ukraine. Commercial imagery satellites could also find themselves the subject of kinetic and cyber attacks, which raises questions about how and whether governments would retaliate against an adversary's strike on a private system and thereby increase the threat of escalation. Finally, as we discussed earlier, just as commercial satellites can collect open source intelligence on American adversaries, they have the potential to provide information about U.S. military operations to those same adversaries in ways that could jeopardize our own operations and installations. Although the United States can regulate the activities of U.S.-based satellite companies, its reach may be more limited in preventing foreign companies from revealing sensitive information. So how will governments, private companies, and citizens alike navigate these trade-offs? States will need to adjust to this new era of wartime transparency, characterized by more widely available open source information from a larger set of public and private actors that can disseminate the information with greater speed, thereby constraining the freedom of action governments once enjoyed as they adapt to a world with fewer secrets. Political leaders will need to consider the implications of having satellite imagery confirm or contradict their claims about battlefield progress. Intelligence officials will need to devise best practices for synthesizing classified and open source intelligence and for sharing this information with allies, partners, and the public. Military planners will need to prepare for a future in which their operations can be detected and disclosed in near real time by foreign firms that operate beyond the reach of US regulations. And the United States should move now to plan for future conflicts that will unfold under the gaze of private satellites. Many thanks, and I'm happy to entertain your questions.
Thank you so much. That was really great. I really enjoyed that. So yes, now we'll move over to the Q&A session. So please get your hands raised, get ready to ask questions. Just for a couple of housekeeping rules. So the first half of, so the lecture was recorded, but this Q&A session is not going to be recorded.